Good afternoon to our viewers in Germany and good morning to our viewers in the United States. I'm Steve Sokol, the president of the American Council on Germany. Thank you for joining us for today's discussion about the internal and external challenges to democracy. This event, of course, is timed to coincide with the Biden administration's Summit for Democracy, which began yesterday and continues today. And I'm very pleased to welcome two experts who have each spent much of their careers focused on the challenges to democracy in full-fledged democracies, but also in failed and failing states. But before I introduce them, I'd like to thank the Heinrich-Böll-Stiftung for supporting today's event. Dr. Frances Brown is a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment, where she also serves as the co-director of the Democracy, Conflict, and Governance Program. She's worked in the government, in the White House under Presidents Obama and Trump, and at USAID. But she's also worked for NGOs and nonprofits. Throughout her career, she has looked at ways in which democratic institutions and practices can be shored up against domestic and foreign threats. Frances, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure.
And also with us from Berlin is Ralf Fücks. He is the managing director of the Center for Liberal Modernity in Berlin, which he co-founded after spending more than 20 years as the president of the Heinrich-Böll-Stiftung, the political foundation which is associated with the German Green Party. For many years, he has been following the challenges to liberal democracy in Europe and around the world. Ralf, herzlich willkommen.
Thanks a lot, Steve. I'm delighted to reconnect and looking forward to our conversation.
Well, it is good to see you again, Ralf. And Frances, I'm delighted to have you with us. We're here, of course, to talk about the Democracy Summit. The summit that's going on right now is the first of two proposed gatherings that focus on renewing democracy in the United States and around the world. Holding this summit is an important step in meeting one of President Biden's campaign promises. But one of the open questions is how much a meeting like this can actually achieve. On the one hand, the Summit for Democracy is intended as a call to action to support democratic institutions and practices against authoritarianism and populist trends. It is framed as an opportunity for democratic governments to prove that they can actually solve problems for their citizens. But on the other hand, one could argue that this is sort of nothing more than a giant Zoom meeting involving more than 100 world leaders and representatives from the private sector. So let's start by talking about what each of you expects from the summit and whether you think it was important to hold this meeting at this time. Frances, let's start with you. The summit fulfills one of Biden's campaign promises, but was this the best time to do this?
Thanks, Stephen. I think it's a really important question. In some ways, it was a really important time to hold this summit because, as you note, we are going through a massive democratic recession globally. According to Freedom House, we are at 15 years and counting of a democratic decline, if you look at both political rights and civil liberties globally. So democracy is really under assault globally. So in that sense, it is important to have some really concerted attention on democracy. It's also important that President Biden has made democracy and human rights a centerpiece of his foreign policy. He's talked about it a lot. So has our Secretary of State, Antony Blinken. So in that sense, it is the right time to hold the summit. The other reason we are holding the summit, as you allude to, Stephen, is this was a campaign promise. This was two sentences in a foreign affairs article when now President Biden was just Democratic primary candidate Biden. And that has really been driving the momentum. Of course, when he made this promise initially, the envisioned event was an in-person event, a really consequential meeting of world leaders. Because of the pandemic intervening, that won't be possible. So I think it's a really important open question. In terms of whether it will achieve the outcomes that we all want, a renewal of democracy globally, there is so much that really remains to be seen over the next year. So the next year, the Biden administration has said is going to be the, quote, year of action. So the intent of this week's event is basically to lay out commitments for all 110 participating governments to lay out commitments of how they will help renew democracy, both in their country and around the world. And then they are meant to execute on those commitments over the next year. And then there's an intention to hold Summit Round 2 about a year from now. So I know my colleagues who are still in the US government are already looking forward to another year of summit planning. So I think a lot remains to be seen. We can get in a little bit more to how can we make these commitments useful and manageable and actually move the needle on democracy. But I think my top line would be, this is a start if it galvanizes energy, but there's really much more to be determined in the coming year.
Thank you, Frances, for setting the stage. And I'd now sort of like to go across the Atlantic and ask Ralf more or less the same question. I mean, Ralf, you've been dealing with these issues throughout your career in many ways. Were you happy to see this summit take place now, and what do you hope from it?
Yes, basically, I would say independent from the way it was done, you of course can criticize the format and the selection of invitees and not young invitees. I think it was the right signal, or it is the right signal at the right time. As Frances already pointed out, we see a decline, a kind of global recession of democracy since 2006 or 2007, after these promising decade of democratic offensive in the 90s, after the breakdown of the Soviet Empire. So I would say it is high time for not only building an alliance of democracies to counter the anti-liberal counter-revolution and the rise of authoritarian powers we see globally, but also to renew democracy at home. Democratic resilience starts at home in rebuilding our democracies, in defending the integrity of our democratic institutions, not only elections, the division of power, the independence of judiciary and media, but also to increase, I would say, social participation and to overcome the social divide in our societies, which is one, not the only one, but is one important source for the illiberal swing in our societies. So there's a lot of reasons for, let's say, kind of democratic soul searching. What went wrong over the last decade or so, and what must we do to polish again the attractivity of liberal democracies globally?
So I really like that phrase, democratic soul searching, as kind of a way of helping frame the summit that's going on right now. But I wonder, how much soul searching can really take place during some of these sort of just statements to a camera, as opposed to that real soul searching that happens when you sit down with people and are able to talk things out and tease things out. And Frances, you described it as kind of a global renewal of democracy, and that this meeting is in a way going to lay out commitments for the next year, and this coming year has been described as a year of action. So let's maybe talk a little bit about what each of you would consider to be success for this summit. And are there actually metrics that can be used to try to measure success from today until the next summit a year from now? You both talked about the Freedom House report on sort of the decline in democracies after there had been so much hope for the future of democracy in the 1990s. But let's maybe talk a little bit about what your sort of expectations would be coming out of this? And Frances, let's start with you and then go back to Ralf.
So I totally agree with the premise of the question about democratic soul searching, and is this the way that we do it? I also love the phrase democratic soul searching, and I have to say, having been part of my fair share of high-level summits when I was within the US government, yes, a summit is not always the time where real deep soul searching occurs. So the hope is it happens before. I will say, before I get into the success metrics of the summit, the Biden administration has been really clear that the US approaches this from a position of humility. And I would paraphrase Winston Churchill here and say, we come from a position of humility because we have much to be humble about when it comes to democracy. So I think that's really important to lay out. This is not the United States, solely lecturing other countries on their own democratic performance, because we here in our own country have a tremendous amount to work on. So I think that is important as a premise when we think about the gathering and the success metrics. So now to sort of how will this actually be a success? How will it start the meaningful change we want? I think it's important to think about what is the sort of theory of success of any summit. And with this particular gathering, President Biden made this promise, Summit for Democracy, but he didn't really lay out any further detail as a candidate. And it really could have gone two directions, at least in my view. One would have been a much smaller affair where the United States invited valued long-term democratic allies like Germany and a few others, a really small tent. And that would have been, I think, more of a situation of shoring up this tight club of democracies to hopefully then bolster democracy globally. The Biden administration did not take that approach. They clearly took a much more big tent approach. There are 110 invitees. Many of them are not fully consolidated democracies. We've got invitees like the Democratic Republic of Congo, Iraq, Philippines. So there's a lot of democracies that have a lot to work on, to put it generously. There was a rationale behind that, which gets towards the commitments. I think the rationale was, if you're asking countries to work on their democracy, to make commitments to reform, you need to invite countries. you need those countries to be involved, and that there was perhaps more traction to be had by bringing them into the tent and asking them to make a pledge along with us to reform than there was keeping them outside. One can debate the merits either way, but I think it's a logical rationale. And so now the question is, how do we actually make that deliver? So as to the commitments, so yes, each head of government is making about a 3-minute speech yesterday and today where they lay out their country's commitments for democratic reform. This obviously leaves a lot to the interpretation of the heads of government and of those governments themselves. What is a commitment and what will be meaningful? These commitments are meant to be both about internal democratic reforms, internal democratic renewal, as well as how they will stand for global democracy, so support democracy beyond their borders. In order for these commitments to actually achieve the change that we want, I think I will be looking for a few things. One is, are these commitments tangible, concrete? Saying something lofty like we'll support free media doesn't really get at the brass tacks of how you make a democratic change. So are they concrete and meaningful and robust? Then a lot will depend on, again, what is the accountability mechanism in the year of action? So there's been a lot of talk about civil society having a key role in monitoring commitments. I think that's absolutely appropriate. We want civil society to be involved, but it is not enough to just tell civil society, go and watch your government's commitments and how they're, executing on their pledges. So civil society of Democratic Republic of Congo, we want you to be involved. If civil society doesn't have a meaningful way to then affect accountability, they can raise all the flags they want, but it won't go anywhere. So then the second part of the accountability for these commitments, in my view, has to be that, the US government, to take the Congo example again, the US embassy in the Democratic Republic of Congo has to also see it as their job to hold their partner government to account, to listen to civil society and really say, hey, you made these 5 commitments. Where are you on each of those? So I think there's a lot that remains to be seen on that. The final point I want to raise on commitments, just it almost is too obvious to state, but I think it's actually getting lost in a lot of this conversation. So there are ruling governments who are making these commitments right now on December 10. Over the next year, perhaps a quarter of those governments could turn over by democratic means, because after all, these are all democracies. And if we are looking at long-term commitments over the next 4 years, many of these governments could turn over. As you all know very well, and Germany knows very well, a successor government doesn't necessarily feel beholden to the pledges of a prior government. So I think when we rest the entire theory of success of this summit exclusively on what pledges governments make, we're leaving a lot of other democratic challenges unaddressed and unanswered. I'll leave it there. I'm curious your thoughts, Ralf.
Yeah, thank you, Francis. That is excellent. You've put a lot out there, and so Ralf, I mean, I would love it if you could pick up on some of the things that Francis touched on, starting with whether you think the summit might have been better with a smaller number of countries that are committed democracies rather than this larger group of countries with some where one can question to what degree they are democracies.
Oh, I would agree to Francis that it was a wise decision to put the circle, or to draw the circle wider, and to include, I would say, a lot of countries which are at the brink, between at least electoral democracies and kind of deterioration into kind of semi or full-fledged authoritarianism. And one of the worrying observations in the last years had not only be the rise, the very self-assertive rise of dictatorships like China and Russia, but the deterioration of democratic standards in former, even liberal democracies. We can see it in Europe with Poland and Hungary, but also all over the place. And if you look into the presidentship of Mr. Trump, then you had a lot of, I would say, illiberal tendencies, even in the backbone of global democracy, the US. So to restore, I would say, the commitments and a certain degree of accountability of governments to stick to the basic principles and institutions of democratic governance, I think it's a useful enterprise. Of course, the outcome of this summit will not be any kind of binding commitments. It's not about a treaty. It's not about to build a new international institution, but maybe putting again democracy in the center of the international policy agenda and creating a kind of dynamics of commitments. This would already be a success. And finally, I would say it could be a milestone towards a global alliance of democracies, what Francis called a club of democracies, not a fixed institution, but then a coalition of countries who are willing and determined to defend democracy at home and abroad.
So Ralf, I have two follow-up questions for you, and they go in different directions, but they build off of things that Francis said and or alluded to. And the first is, Francis brought up sort of the role of civil society, particularly when it comes to the accountability for whatever the metrics are that are introduced here. Of course, in your work, Ralf, at the Center for Liberal Modernity, you look very closely at the role that civil society can play. And I'd love to get your thoughts on how civil society can help hold governments accountable.
Because this is I would say, the traditional view on civil society, that civil society, I would say the organized civil societies, NGOs, think tanks, foundations, etc. These are the watchdogs, and they create a kind of monitoring structure for governmental policies and party politics. But I would say over the last decade or so, the term civil society a little bit lost its innocence, because we see now the surge of a lot of illiberal populist movements, driving xenophobic or authoritarian and illiberal tendencies. So it's not just the polarization between governments and civil society. We see a political and cultural polarization in our societies.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, Frances, please.
If I may, I just to build on that, I agree. In best case, civil society are the watchdogs, while also agreeing that we've seen emergence of new types of it, particularly over the last 10 years. But I just want to add that in many of the places where democracy is most under assault, civil society itself is under assault and has really suffered from closing space over the last 10 years. So again, when we think of our theory of success of the summit, saying civil society, go forth and do your good civil society work, that unfortunately comes up against this reality that civil society has been cash strapped or under real security related threats. So this is why I think it is incumbent upon the governments who are participating and the Biden administration as the sponsor in particular to really lay out how civil society is to play this watchdog function in a concrete way, and actually feed into real accountability measures for the summit.
Yeah, it would be really a very substantial step if countries like, or if states like the US and the European Union would restore their obligation to support democratic civil society activists in authoritarian or semi-authoritarian countries. Yeah. For us in Europe, I think it's mainly about Russia, where we can see a constant process of silencing civil society, of putting citizens' initiatives underwater, of criminalizing civil rights groups or shutting down independent media. This is a creeping process, and I think for us it's not only a moral duty. If we want to keep up any hope for change in these countries in the I would say in mid future. We have to renew our obligation to support these people and to support these organizations.
Yeah, I mean, Ralf, I would say the list is a lot longer. It's not just Russia, as you mentioned, but places like Belarus, Turkey. The list is a long list. So in our conversation, we've already started to move away from the summit itself, which is what I wanted to do. And we've started to dig a little bit deeper. And Frances, you talked about the US approaching the summit from a position of humility, which I think is very important, particularly as we're 1 month away from the 1-year anniversary of the January 6th insurrection. And so I'd maybe like to get you to talk in a little bit more detail about how you see the Biden administration responding to some of these internal and external challenges to democracy here at home, because they're not all just homegrown. There are some external challenges as well. And then we can continue the conversation by looking at sort of what's going on in other parts of the world as well.
So the Biden administration has made it really clear that they view our own internal democratic renewal as important as our outward looking. So I think that's a start. The first step is acknowledging you have a problem. So they've been really good on that. Their challenge is that as the White House, as the executive branch, their hands are tied in making some really key reforms. And some viewers may not be as familiar with the US system, but there are real limitations on what a White House can do to get at some of the really anti-democratic trends in the United States. So the Biden administration can issue executive orders, which have a certain amount of authority, but to really make some of the reforms that are needed democratically in terms of a more representative forum elections, really getting at voting rights in a sweeping way, getting at issues of gerrymandering, of sort of warped districts, all these anti-democratic trends that are happening in the United States. Unfortunately, from my perspective as someone who would like to see reforms, the Biden administration or the Biden White House can't really do without Congress on board. And currently, the Biden administration's party, the Democrats, have a slim majority in both chambers of Congress, but it hasn't proven enough to get some of these issues through. So this is a real awkwardness of both the summit and the broader issue of linking democratic renewal at home to our sort of outward-looking democracy policy. So I would say that progress has been inevitably slow on that. They are trying through some executive orders on some discrete issues. And they also have a lot else on their plate in terms of getting major spending bills across the wire. So it's been slow so far. In terms of the way they view and they're going about addressing the global democratic recession, so beyond the US, what are they doing? So the way the US government shows love is by holding a big summit, and that is what they are doing. But my concern here is that while they are holding this summit, there's a whole other array of democratic issues that even if the summit is wildly successful on its own terms, it will never get at. So as we've discussed before, there are, quote, only 110 invitees. So countries that are slipping away from democracy who were not invited, there's no even theory within the summit of how those countries will be, how the US will be helping nudge them along the democratic spectrum. It's been a record-setting year for coups, as you may know, unfortunately. None of those countries are invited, Sudan, Myanmar, Chad, but we, the United States, if we are going to put democracy at the center of our foreign policy, really need to have a policy for how are we helping navigate those coups and the aftermath? How are we trying to push for more democracy? In addition, there's a number of really important elections coming up over the next year. Just in Africa, I'm looking at Kenya very closely, and then Nigeria early in 2023. These are countries where, again, the US needs to be weighing in and engaging on aiding democracy. And here again, the summit is not the venue that you're going to do that. So the concern here is that the Biden administration has understandably been so preoccupied by getting this summit off the ground that it's possible that other democratic imperatives have been left by the wayside. The last thing I'll say on this, and I'm curious your thoughts, is that I've said it multiple times, but a democracy summit is not a democracy strategy globally. And there has to be a broader strategic approach of, that ideally the summit would fit into, of how the United States is going to address global democratic backsliding. And so far, I think there's been so much energy devoted towards the summit that sort of broader strategic view, I haven't seen come out as much. The United States is putting out its national security strategy probably early next year. And I think that will be unclassified, or most of it will be unclassified. So perhaps that will lay out the sort of democracy strategy within that. But I am staying tuned on that question.
So to summarize some of what you're saying, I mean, it sounds as if, the Democracy Summit is good and it's important, but it is by no means enough. there is far more that needs to be done. And Ralf, I'm confident that you would agree with that.
Yeah,
well.
of course it's not a surrogate for a democracy promotion strategy at home, domestically and internationally. And to start with the international chapter, I think we have to restructure our democracy assistance internationally, starting, which I think was a very remarkable topic on the agenda of the Democracy Summit now, in more consistent and more determined fight against corruption. Corruption is one of the main sources of undermining democratic institutions and the integrity of our public space, money laundering, all this kind of stuff. Also tax evasion, which is eroding, I would say, trust in democratic institutions and in social justice at home. Another important element, in my view, is increase support for key swing states in the battle between democracy and authoritarianism. To give an example, Ukraine. In my view, Ukraine is absolutely a key state for the future, not only of Central Eastern Europe, but also for the future of Russia itself. And this is why Putin is so aggressively attacking Ukraine, including the current military threat, because he is not so much afraid of NATO. What he is most afraid of is a successful democratic transformation of Ukraine, politically and economically successful. So supporting these states, I would say, on the borderline in the battle between democracy and authoritarianism is an absolute key element. Assistance to independent media and investigative journalism and NGOs, all these kind of stuff has to be put again in a more strategic, long-term policy, and at best a coordinated policy between the US and Europe and other who are willing to join this effort. So at the same time, we need more public diplomacy in the battle of ideas and information. Yeah, there's a whole range of efforts we have to take to regain ground internationally. But again, I would say the major battle has to be fought at home. Yeah, to restore the legitimacy of liberal democracies, not only in terms of input legitimacy, free and fair elections and the whole bunch of democratic institutions, judiciary and then parliaments and so on, but to improve our output legitimacy. We are in a global battle on output legitimacy with the authoritarian powers, with China on top. Yeah, the message of the Chinese leadership is, oh, forget about democracy, forget about elections and civil rights and independent judiciary. It's all about performance. Yeah, it's all about economic growth and social upward mobility and stability and improving the everyday life of hundreds and hundreds of millions of people. And on the one hand, I would, of course, question that. Yeah, democracy is a value in itself. It's a matter of human dignity. So we have to defend democracy as a matter of a free and meaningful life. But at the same time, we cannot escape the competition on performance, on output legitimacy. And I think this is a key battleground, and we have just to become better. Yeah, we have to become better in managing climate change and the transition to climate neutral economies and societies, in restoring the promise of social upward mobility, equal opportunities for all, and these kind of issues.
So obviously it's a very ambitious agenda when looking at home and abroad, and each of you have talked about some of the things that need to be done at home. One of our viewers submitted a question that you've sort of touched on, Ralf, and I think you did earlier as well, Francis. But our viewer writes, shouldn't it also be part of stabilizing democracy to fight against growing economic, social, unjust distribution of wealth? So some of the social inequities that exist in our societies. How important? Yeah, I mean, you're both nodding. So Francis, why don't you go first, and then Ralf?
Absolutely. I think when we take this global democratic recession and take a step back from it, we have to really think about what are the reasons for that? What are the reasons for increasing disenchantment with democracy among people who live in democracies? And inequality, economic inequality, is one of the main drivers of that. And the feeling that even as economic growth happens at the top line, it is not actually trickling down to the majority of the population, is a tremendous driver of disenchantment in many countries. The Biden administration, I think, to their great credit, has acknowledged this and has come up with this phrase that democracy must deliver, or democracy delivers. This idea that democracy needs to solve people's problems. It's not enough, and this absolutely echoes Ralf's points just now about input legitimacy and output legitimacy. It's not enough to say, oh, you've got political rights, you can vote. Isn't that satisfying enough in and of itself? If you don't see the fact that you can vote actually demonstrably solving your everyday problems. So I think it's to their credit that they are framing the mission around that. The much bigger challenge is now, how do we actually resolve that issue of democracy needing to deliver? I think the pandemic is another example of this. When you look at particularly the early months of the pandemic and which countries responded capably and relatively effectively to the pandemic and which did not, that did not break down along regime type lines. It was not the case, unfortunately, that democracies did better overall than authoritarian systems. It was also not the case that authoritarian systems did better than democracies. Some democracies did really well. So think of New Zealand in the early months in particular. Some democracies did very poorly. Think of the United States in the early months. And the same goes for authoritarian systems. So the pandemic has also kind of called into question this idea that we can just have a narrative that one system is better than the other. So it's absolutely, it is up for contestation which system is better. And I think at least we are getting at that issue of democracy needs to deliver.
I absolutely agree. If you're looking to the root causes of this growing wave of illiberal populism, within democracies, I think the growing social polarization is one of the major origins, and it has very, I would think, the basic root causes for that. Yeah, both globalization, which has been an important change of the economic structure over the last 30 years, and the digital revolution, which is now the main factor for technological change. They created this kind of division between, I would say, winners and losers of these basic transformation. Yeah, those who are well equipped for a globalized and a digital world, who are benefiting from it, who see a widening personal options and benefiting with higher wages and and the other ones who feel threatened, and who fear social degradation, and we have to address this divide, and create the new opportunities and also tools for a much broader social and economic participation in our societies. Of course, education is playing a major role in that, enabling people in dealing with these new challenges. And in general, I would say we have to rediscover the importance of the public commons, public education, public healthcare, public transport, access to high-speed internet for everybody. These are public goods our governments have to deliver.
Let me push you both on this a little bit. I think it's really helpful, Ralf, to outline some of these overarching trends that we've seen and that we're dealing with, that contribute to this notion of winners and losers and people who are left behind. And certainly it's fair to say that even before the pandemic, we were seeing a rise in authoritarianism. But it seems almost as if there was a perfect storm over the last 18 months during the pandemic, which has actually hurt democracies even more and strengthened some authoritarian regimes. How do we deal with that conundrum?
I'll go first quickly. I agree, absolutely. So we have the perfect storm is the perfect analogy. We did have this long-standing 15-year decline for a lot of sort of long simmering reasons that we've touched upon. And then the pandemic started in early 2020. And what the pandemic did is it gave authoritarians a pretext that in their wildest dreams, they might not have envisioned, a pretext to expand their executive power where they wanted, a pretext in many cases to postpone elections, a pretext to clamp down on civil society in the name of public health, a pretext to clamp down on dissent in the name of public health. It provided a huge challenge to independent media, both because of economic revenues. Advertisers didn't want their ads next to articles about death and destruction nonstop, which is what the pandemic news cycle essentially was, as well as it made it really hard for journalists to do their jobs. And it stopped economic activity in many, many places, which just added to the challenges. So it absolutely was a perfect storm. That isn't to say it was exclusively bad news. The pandemic did spur some innovations in terms of how we think about organizing and mobilizing and democratic participation from remote vantage points. So there were some silver linings. But overall, it was a real challenge. And now the challenge going forward, among others, is, first of all, when do we know this pandemic is over? It sort of seems like we're moving into the new normal. So when can we say, this is over? And then relatedly, for all of these expansions of executive authority that I mentioned just a couple minutes ago, when do we sunset those? When do we say, again, this pandemic is over enough that, we need to go back to business more as usual? And I really don't think we collectively have sorted that out.
Yeah, I would say the pandemic was at the same time a kind of indicator of the degree of democratic crisis we are facing, the mistrust in governments, the mistrust in public institutions, even the mistrust in science. And it was an accelerator of these young trends. Also of In my opinion, it sharpened, increased the polarization in our societies. If we are looking at Germany, we have around about, I would say, 20% of the people who are becoming more and more radical in their opposition against public health policies. Yeah. And you have a huge upswing in this minority of the society. You have a huge upswing in all kind of conspiracy myths, yeah, and all kind of, I would say, irrational ways of thinking. And as far as I get it, in the US, you have an even wider polarization, if it comes, for instance, to vaccination, and we have to very carefully deal with this. At the one hand, of course, we cannot just exclude these people from the democratic process, but at the same time, we need determined and forward-looking policies to overcome the pandemic. And in the long term, again, I would say it's about performance and competition and the ability to deal with crises. Yeah, this will not have been the last crisis. And this is why I like the term democratic resilience. We have to improve the resilience of our democracies in dealing with unforeseen shocks and crises, including our ability to innovate. Yeah.
Oh, excuse me, sorry.
Yeah, please.
Just to add on, you inspired me on the anti-vax comment. So yes, here in the United States, we have a very robust anti-vaccination constituency. It's worth noting we've always had a small segment of the population who's anti-vaccination. And it exists on sort of both the right and the left for different reasons. But the pandemic has really taken it to a whole new level in terms of political mobilization and some really anti-government action. So one of our states, the state of Michigan, the governor was the subject of a plot to kidnap her, to armed kidnap because she was trying to enforce masking regulations. So it's really been an extraordinary degree of that sentiment. The other thing, to go back to an earlier point you made, Ralf, on mistrust, and the pandemic is an accelerator of mistrust. I completely agree with this. And one notable finding, a colleague of mine, Rachel Kleinfeld, looked at how well governments responded in the early months of the pandemic, how effective they were. And one thing she found is that the biggest determinant of how well a country overall fared in responding to the pandemic was the degree of trust between society and the government. The idea that the society trusted the government to be basically giving them good guidance. And again, this didn't break down clearly along democracies versus authoritarian systems. There were some democracies with high degrees of trust and some with low degrees of trust. But the trust issue, I think, is really essential as we think about going forward.
Mm-hmm. So as we start to sort of pull some of these threads together, I mean, obviously the issue of trust in democracy is an important one, and that's nothing new. That's something that's come up in conversations over and over again. And as we've been reflecting on these trends, as we've looked at our political system in the US, Germany's just come out of an election, and there were some questions around trusting the government, trusting the parties, trusting the candidates, although not quite as extreme. But you know, Francis, earlier you said something along the lines of a democracy summit does not a democracy strategy make. And so I'd like to talk to you both about, you know, this strategic approach and how countries like the US and Germany, or even Europe for that matter, can serve as counterweights to authoritarian regimes and trends, but also to think about what kind of leverage countries like Germany and the US have, particularly when thinking about how sort of ambitious the agenda is when one thinks about addressing some of these very important domestic issues, like the digital divide, like the trust and confidence that seems to be waning in democratic institutions and practices, but also in science, in the media, and where this skepticism is coming from. So the central question is how can the U.S. and Germany serve as models, and what sort of leverage might they have on the global stage?
I would say, again, with the focus on the domestic arena, if we ask ourselves, why are we in a crisis of democracies? I would even say as a result of their success. If you're looking to the 90s, you could even start earlier in the 70s of the last century. We had a long wave of democratization and liberalization. Very strong. Yeah, it changed Western societies, made them much more liberal, more pluralistic, more inclusive, women and migrants, and and internationally, of course, it was a very strong turnaround from authoritarian, especially socialist, communist countries to democracies. And now, and you could also include technological innovation, the rise of the internet, and all these kind of inventions, initially very promising inventions. And now I would say at the height of this success story, things are turning around. And when I'm asking myself and others, why is that? I think we have to be aware that this kind of liberal revolution created at the same time a huge turmoil. Yeah, we are living in an historical era of rapid and fundamental change. Things are changing extremely rapidly, economically, technologically, culturally. And this creates a growing sense, a growing desire for stability and security. And in my view, a basic challenge for liberal democracies is that we have to find a balance or to bridge, on the one hand, between dynamism, innovation, economic growth, and this need for security, belonging, and stability. And this is, in my view, one of the big challenges for the next decade we have to master if we want to regain trust and acceptance and legitimacy for our liberal democracies.
Well, before you weigh in, Francis, let me just ask Ralf a follow-up question specifically related to Germany, because as we all know, a new government just formed in Berlin this week. The election took place in late September, and it took a little while for the coalition negotiations to unfold, but not too long.
Oh, quite a short while, yeah.
In comparison with last time, a very short time. And in my mind, this government has elements both of continuity, but also of change. The continuity coming from the fact that the chancellor is the former vice chancellor, came out of the grand coalition, but changed because it's including new partners like the Green Party and the Free Democrats. And so you're talking about the need for both dynamism and stability. Is that what you would expect from this government? And how much do you think this government can contribute when it comes to tackling some of these challenges that we're talking about?
This is really a key question. What I am optimistic or even a little bit hopeful about is that this coalition tries to restore a sense of progress. and a sense of a kind of inclusive modernization. I would use these two terms. Yeah? And part of the explanation for the crisis of liberal democracies is that over the last 2 or 3 decades, we lost this sense of progress, this trust that we can shape the future for better. Yeah, and this coalition is trying to restore this kind of narrative of progress, combining ecological modernization. So it will boost the transition of the German economy towards a climate neutral economy, social participation, social inclusion, and at the same time renewing a sense for civil liberty. And if we manage to combine these 3 elements, it could really become a success story.
Thank you, Ralf. Francis, just to pick up on that, we have a relatively new government here in the United States. I've not necessarily thought of it as being a government of inclusive modernization. But having said that, there are many items on the Biden administration's agenda that would fit that description and that narrative. And so I guess my first question to you is how do you look at the Biden administration in this vein? But then also to come back to the closing question of what kind of leverage a country like the U.S. has when trying to serve as a model to other parts of the world.
Yeah, so on the Biden administration, I think it's maybe even under-recognized that they've actually successfully pushed through a series of pretty progressive legislative bills that maybe get lost in all of the sort of political drama, but when you come to actual effects on the ground, getting at some of these issues we've talked about, income equality and the rest, I think they deserve some credit. On the leverage, I know we're short on time, so I'll just be brief on this. I think as we think about how the US can serve as a positive model globally and affect positive change globally, 2 things. One is, yes, they need to get beyond the summit to a strategy. I would say the strategy needs to grapple with some really fundamental questions on democracy. Number one, how do we get at this issue that it's not all about Russia and China? The reasons for democracy and democratic malaise in many key countries like India or Brazil aren't principally the result of Russian and Chinese meddling. There's other causes. So they need a theory that gets at that. Second, they really need to get at the fact that the US has some really awkward friendships when it comes to democratic values, not the US-Germany friendship, but the US-Egypt friendship, the US-India friendship. These are some really awkward partnerships we have and some increasingly problematic countries from a democratic standpoint. So how do we get at that? And then third, they needed to get at this issue that democracy really does need to deliver, needs to solve people's problems. In terms of their leverage, I would say briefly that there are many forms of US leverage. A lot of them we're not going to see in the headlines. A lot of it happens behind closed doors. But one domain that I'm really interested in is security assistance. That is often where the rubber meets the road for many authoritarian or would-be authoritarian leaders. If you say, we're going to cut off the US aid program that we're giving for anti-corruption, they'll say, okay, too bad. But if you say we're cutting off your security assistance, that gets their attention. So this is something that I will be looking at going forward. How much does the spirit of the Democracy Summit actually end up impacting these really key levers that often are what actually can get some traction and get the attention of leaders overseas? I'll leave it there.
Well, Francis, thank you. And Ralf, thank you as well. This has been an incredibly rich and fascinating conversation. And yet I feel like we're still only sort of skimming the surface of the topics and issues that we could touch on. One of our viewers wrote that the conversation went places that he did not expect. And so I'm glad that we were able to offer some surprises. But I think it's clear to all of us that the issues that we've been talking about today will not be solved tomorrow, and that we will be dealing with these challenges for some time to come. So I hope that we can remain in discussion with each other as we try collectively to address some of these topics and issues. But I thought it was particularly timely to be able to have this conversation with both of you today as the Summit for Democracy is winding up. And I just really want to thank both of you for making the time at this very busy period to talk with us today. So best regards to you both, and wishes for a great weekend.
Thank you very much.
Enjoyed it.
It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.